This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I'm Donna Yarbrough, Director of the Center for Women, and happy Women's History Month to you. Thank you. We're very excited about tonight's talk. I first, right off the bat, want to thank my wonderful, spectacular staff, Chanel Kraft Tanner and Tiffany Del Valle, they're both right there. Yeah, they're just wonderful. So please thank them for this event when you're leaving. I also wanted to let you know that Women's History Month is not over. So there is another event tomorrow night that I think will be of interest to this crowd. We're doing a documentary film screening of a movie called Goals for Girls, a story of women with balls. And it is about the world of women's football in Argentina, and it's gotten rave reviews, and it's supposed to be a really great story. So I encourage you to come to that. It's on Thursday at 6:30 p.m. in the Jones Room of the Woodruff Library. And you can check our website if you need more information. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. When I was doing research to write this introduction, I ran across a wonderful profile of Anita DeFrantz in the Los Angeles Times from 2014, so just a few months ago, that really gives you the highlights, and the article is titled, "How I Made It, Anita L. DeFrantz, President of the LA 84 Foundation." So prick up your ears, because I think she may have something to tell us, and we all might learn something about how to make it. Ms. DeFrantz is, according to the LA Times, a champion performer, and you'll see what I mean in just a second as I read some of her accomplishments. She was on rowing teams that won 6 U.S. championships and reached the World Championship finals 4 times. She earned a bronze medal in the 1976 Olympics and a silver medal in the 78 World Rowing Competition. She made the rowing team for the 1980 Olympic Games, but of course did not compete because of the U.S. boycott. And if she doesn't cover it in her talk, you should really ask her a question about that, because she has quite a story to tell about what happened there. All of this happened despite the fact that DeFrantz was raised in Indianapolis, a segregated place her father called the northernmost southern town in the country. And DeFrantz said she'd been an avid swimmer since age 4, but opportunities to compete were limited. A quote from her, "There were no sports allowed for African-American girls in Indianapolis, nothing." Despite this, she continued her sporting career and also was elected to the International Olympic Committee in 1986 and to the IOC's Executive Board in 1992. In 1997, DeFrantz was the first woman elected vice president of the organization, so yay for being a first. And last year, she was elected again to the IOC board. Since 1987, she's been president of the LA 84 Foundation, a charitable organization that runs off of an endowment of surplus funds from the Los Angeles Games, Olympic Games. In the 3 decades since those games, LA 84 has donated more than $214 million, it's probably more by now, to more than 1,100 Southern California youth sports programs, and has provided opportunities for more than 3 million children. Quite an accomplishment. So please join me in welcoming Anita DeFrantz to Emory University.
Well, thank you very much for being here and giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts from you. I have a lot to say, so I might go a little faster than I should. But at the end, I'll ask you to do a favor for me. So let's begin. I believe that access to sports is a birthright. Humans are the only species that take part in sport. I've never seen another species set up hurdles and race across the hurdles to see who could get there first. I have seen ants crawl onto twigs, but I've never seen them line up those twigs and race across the puddle. It's an activity that is unique to human beings. Sports is a uniquely human endeavor because we enjoy how sport uses the brain to direct the body through the dimension of time and space. And all sports have that in common. We enjoy talking about competition. We enjoy being in competition. We enjoy, if we're not competing, our communities are bound together by a team or individual who represents us. So sports is very important to the human existence. And now I have to do this again. One of the important things in sports is you have a moment of excellence. Now, I suppose people in this room have taken part in sports. If you have, how many of you have had that one moment where everything has just been exquisite and worked perfectly? Yeah, how about that? How about that? Mine was during a college basketball contest where I now know what it was. I took down a rebound, and it was a blind outlet pass, so I, without looking, tossed it to almost the other end of the court because I knew Leslie would be exactly where I'd thrown the ball, and she made a basket. And it was just magical. I didn't think about it, I just did it. And the thing about these moments of excellence is you can build on them. I mean, I am telling you as though it was yesterday, and it was many moons ago that I was in college at Connecticut College, well, in college at all. So sports has the possibility for everyone to have a moment of excellence and build upon that moment of excellence for the rest of their lives. Which I need to do right here. Okay. Now, one of the things about sport is that there is this thing called the amateur rule. Now, a lot of people don't realize that the amateur rule initially was designed to keep rich people apart from the working stiffs. And in fact, I knew of a gentleman named Jack Kelly, Senior, who wanted to row at the Henley because that was, other than the Olympic Games, that was the biggest regatta, the Royal Henley Regatta, or Henley Royal Regatta, I have to get that right. And he was denied that opportunity because he was a bricklayer. He wasn't making money in his sport, but because he worked, he was denied that opportunity. His son certainly avenged him by going to the regatta and winning what's called the Diamond Sculls. Of course, his daughter became a movie star and then married a prince and was Princess Grace. So the next generation did a lot about getting over the amateur rules. But one of the things that we have found that's very important, and you'll see up there that even in the Olympic Charter, the word amateur doesn't exist. Amateur exists in this world almost exclusively in the United States, and it's in part because of the NC2A. And as you know, there's some things about that may be changing as the student athletes are saying, wait a minute, why can't we get paid? Which is a very important question to ask. But in the Olympic Games, there's no more amateur rule. There's the eligibility rule, and athletes who compete at the Games have to be eligible under the rules of their sport. Now, since sports is a birthright, I truly believe that everyone must have access to sports. And I get to talk about the place where I've worked for the last 30 years, the LA84 Foundation, which is dedicated to providing youth, working with youth through sports. And we say that we're getting kids life ready through sports because all of life's lessons can be felt through sport. Everything that happens to you in life can happen to you in the field of play, but it's a much safer environment. At the LA84 Foundation, we are the legacy of the 1984 Games, and we received $93 million, 40% of the surplus from those games. The other 60% went to the United States Olympic Committee, and they have an endowment which supports them each year. They get one check a year. But what we do in Southern California is we teach people how to coach, We run programs so children can learn how to swim. We've taught more than, I guess we're about 300,000 kids how to swim, and they learn the other aquatic sports, diving, synchronized swimming, and water polo. And we want to make sure that these kids have a good experience in all of the aquatic sports. We also teach people how to coach, because in this country, typically you're given a clipboard and a whistle and told you're the coach without any other instruction. In other countries where sports is a part of what the federal government offers, they have schools where you have to learn about being a coach before they put you in front of kids, which I think is a very important thing. We also have seminars on issues of importance in sports. In 1989, after the 88 games in Seoul, and of course, you guys might be too young. This is always embarrassing. When now I'm going to forget his name, the gentleman from Ben Johnson, how could I forget his name, was found to have doped. He had won the 100 meters, in the men's 100 meters, and it was the first time a high-profile athlete had been caught at the games. By the way, he was celebrated in Canada as a great citizen, and the day that he was found to have doped, he was suddenly from Jamaica. I don't know. Go figure. Anyway, we had a conference on steroids and produced a magazine called Sports Devastated, with permission from Sports Illustrated. And it was a great conference where we heard from one man who had been a part of developing steroids and what the purpose was. And so we can do that. We can bring together people and talk about issues that are very important to sport. And I'm proud to say that we're in the process of digitizing our entire library, which is the best sports library in, I'll say in the universe, why not? Who's gonna stop me? Of course, we're not digitizing anything that's still under copyright. And I remember when, I guess it was Google was talking about digitizing every book in the world, and I thought, how can they do that? There are copyright rules, and we are abiding by the copyright rules. But soon, you'll be able to see you here in this room, wherever you are. In another year, we'll be able to see our whole collection on the internet, and we're very proud of that. We were the first. I had told my board that having a website is just essential, and this was back in 1992. And so in 1993, we became the first 1% of the first 1% to have a website. I was a little embarrassed when we told them that, but there's so many people with websites now, it was okay to be the first 1% of the first 1%. Okay, I have to use the right. Okay, so the purpose of me being here is to talk about Title IX. Why is Title IX important? Well, I've already told you that access to sports is a birthright. And now I'm going to tell you that you can tell how just a society is by who has access to sport. It's just it follows that if sports should be available for everybody, if a society is keeping out people, that's a bad thing. And unfortunately, the United States of America was ranking very low on the justice rankings for nations, since half the population was de facto excluded from taking part in sport before Title IX. So it wasn't a pretty picture. Title IX of the Education Amendments is only 37 words long. But those 37 words have made a huge difference in the way this nation is run. And there they are. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. I say so few words for so much. The significant dates for Title IX are its enactment on June 23, 1972. It's interesting. June 23 is the anniversary of the Olympic movement. So it's funny that that date would be parallel like that. Now, it took a while to get the regs adopted, and the regs, there were hearings, about 10,000 proposals were made about the Title IX. And it's interesting because there were very few hearings before the passage. So the legislative history is very meager. So when they go back to look what was intended, there's not much to find, which is good because it's not locked in a box. And it wasn't until 1978 that mandatory compliance was required for all of the universities. So from 72 to 76, that was actually 3 presidents of the United States of America. Nixon signed it in. He had some problems, so Ford took over. And then your own, from this community, Jimmy Carter, was finally in office when the mandatory compliance took place. Names to remember. Too often, the names of women are forgotten in history. It's really horrible. There's a great book that I want to recommend to you. It was first titled The Women's History of the World, and it's by Rosalind Miles. But she retitled it a few years later, Who Cooked the Last Supper? Which is a great title because, you know, if it had been a man, you would know the name. But we don't know who cooked the Last Supper. And that is her point. So I suggest that you take a look at that book. You can get it on Amazon or some other, maybe Barnes & Noble even. But the names you should remember are Bunny Sandler, who was a part-time professor at the University of Maryland, who asked why she was being denied advancement and contacted the Office of Civil Rights in the Education Department. And there she found a sympathetic ear, a gentleman who had been looking for the appropriate case for many years to take because he knew that women in academia were being discriminated against. And my mother was a professor, and I know that she was going through a really hard time trying to get promoted at the University of Indiana in Indianapolis. We call it UEPUE for that reason and others. But so I had firsthand knowledge, not only my being denied access to sport. By the way, I have 3 brothers who are wonderful, and they tried their best to keep me involved. So when we played touch football on the block, I was the quarterback, because you can't touch the quarterback, and I can still do a pretty good spiral, I think. Impressive. But that's the way it was. Now, most people know that Senator Birch Bayh was involved. He's also from Indiana. But most people don't remember that Representative Edith Green from Portland was there. You should remember Patsy Mink, who was really a part of drafting the language. And I'll tell you that, I shouldn't say this, but Edith Green actually voted against it when it came up on the floor because she wanted some other stuff done on busing, but she later supported it, although she'd been an early person who was on the team. But Mink wrote early drafts of the legislation, and now the act is called the Patsy Takemoto Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act. So Title IX is shorthand for that much longer name. But please remember the names of women because they have been very important in legislation and in every part of life, but their names are often not known. And again, the early focus of Title IX was on helping women get promoted in academia. I didn't mention a word about sport when I read out the language of Title IX. It didn't exist. And only at one hearing, one of the men at the hearing made a joke about co-ed football. Everyone laughed, and that was the end of the hearing. But things that have to do with federal funding are throughout education in our nation. So Title IX was off and running. Now, there have been so many guys who belabor or talk about how horrible Title IX is because it's just destroying their opportunities to take part in sport. Well, that's just not true. There have been more opportunities for boys and men as Title IX was enacted. Of course, the opportunities for women, where it took off like jet fuel, from 30,000 to 193,000 since 1992. Even with that huge increase at the collegiate level, there still are 60,000 more opportunities for men than there are for women. I don't know why. I do know why that is, because there's never enough money. And it's not the fault of the law, which is just those 37 words. It's the fault of the administrators, who have a duty to support all of their students, men and women. You both pay the same tuition. Maybe some have scholarships, but it's the same for everyone. And yet, you're not getting the same opportunities. And that's part of what Title IX was designed to help. And at the high school, you know, there are now 3.2 million girls who are taking part, but there are 4.5 million boys taking part. So guys, you have not been disadvantaged by Title IX. So be supportive. Stop doing all this litigation. And there is enormous amounts of litigation around Title IX. And for you to learn more about that, I didn't want to talk about it because it's just every year there's something different. Someone tries to attack it, and don't get me starting about football. For a very long time, football was trying to carve itself out of Title IX because, after all, it's a revenue sport. Know this about football. There are only 25 programs in this country that take in more revenue than they have expenditures. But they all consider themselves revenue sports. You have to ask the question, is there a balance to that revenue? And of the 400 programs there are, only 25 really have revenue more than expenditures. So where can you learn more about it? Or if you have a case to bring, the Women's Sports Foundation, which was created by Billie Jean King back in the early 70s. I don't have the date, but it's probably on their website. And the National Women's Law Center, which is in Washington, D.C., and they handle litigation and lobbying, and they have been on this for a long time, and they do a great job. So if you want information or advice, those are the two great places to look. Since the passage of Title IX, there have been already 6 times that cases have gone all the way to the Supreme Court, and that is rare for a piece of legislation to get all the way to the Supreme Court, and I am sure there are more to come. I'm going to speak for a moment about wrestling, because Dennis Hastert was a big-time wrestler, and he was determined to destroy Title IX because he felt that his beloved sport was being damaged by Title IX. Well, lo and behold, wrestling was deleted from the Olympic program because the chairman of the International Federation had done nothing about having athletes involved in the sport. They'd done nothing about having women involved in the governance of the sport. They'd done nothing about making the number of opportunities in the sport come close to equality with the male athletes. And so the International Olympic Committee's executive board said, okay, among all these sports, which one has the least to offer? It was wrestling. And they panicked, needless to say, because that's a horrible thing to be taken off the Olympic program. And lo and behold, they found women who could be on the board. They found a better way to score the bouts so that you could understand what was going on. They, of course, booted out the other president. They realized that the NCAA wrestling programs for women were very important to them. And since that time, there hasn't been a single suit filed that I know of. I've been watching this because I think it's quite amusing how important it's become to include women when your life on the Olympic program is troubled. So we've been talking about the U.S. of A. One of the things that was very important to Olympic sport was the passage of the Amateur Sports Act of 1978. It's now the Ted Stevens Olympic and Amateur Sports Act of 1978, because Senator Stevens was very much involved with making sure that athletes would have a chance to have their say and be involved in it and have a fair chance. Now, what was this about? There was a pitched battle going on between an organization called the Amateur Athletic Union, which you may know from Junior Olympics, because That's all they have left. They lost the battle. They had been the governing body for, I think there was a fight over wrestling against the NC2A and the AAU wrestling, but they were the governing body for track and field and swimming and a host of other sports. And under Gerald Ford, a commission on Olympic sports was created, and luminaries went out to look at all of the different sports and to find out what was going on. And they came back and they said, each sport has to have a vertical governance so that they're looking at that sport and doing their best for that sport. Because, you know, if you're doing wrestling and track and field and swimming, how do you do a good job? You don't. So the Amateur Sport Act ended the war between the AAU and the NC2A, and unfortunately the AAU is kind of out of business, save for the Junior Olympics. And they're very happy. They're in Orlando, Florida, and they get support from the second happiest place on earth. The first one, of course, in Southern California. The first, chronologically at least. But that was a battle where athletes were being sanctioned for competing in an activity that was put on by one of the other groups, and then they couldn't come back to the group they were with before, and it was just ridiculous. But that was my first time to testify before Congress. I was invited to testify because I'd been elected to what's called the Athletes Advisory Council. There are lots of A's in sport. Athletes Advisory Council. And one of the important questions that was asked was, well, why is it that athletes should have rights? And I thought, what kind of question is that? And I looked at the rest of the panel. I said, okay, I'll answer. It's because they're decision makers. Athletes have to make so many decisions on the field of play, in getting to the field of play. Their lives are bound with making decisions to do better in competition. So it's absolutely logical that athletes should be decision makers. Athletes at the Olympic Games there was a time when people thought of the 14-year-old gymnast. By the way, you have to be 16 now. You can't be a 14-year-old gymnast. And the divers, who are very young, but the average age of Olympians is actually 25. Now it might be a little bit older, but back when this was passed, the average age was 25. So they're not these little children. These are people who make life decisions in order to compete, because in this country, especially back then, there was little sponsorship support, not a penny from the federal government, and that is true to this day. They support the Paralympics sometimes, but the Olympic Games are not a part of the budget of the federal government, nor any state or local government that I know of. In the United States, this act helped make the Olympic Committee stronger. It also gave all sorts of rights to the words Olympic and all those things so that they're protected. So the USOC is the only organization that can use it for commercial payments. And so it was very important to have that happen, but that also created lots of litigation. So lawyers like sports. So I want to go on and say, so we have Title IX here to get women involved in sport, but what about the rest of the world? What's happening there? I've already said that in most other countries, the national government is involved with providing sports, and that's true. But how well are they doing that? And no other country has Title IX. We're the only country in the world where specifically it says that you shall not discriminate on the basis of sex in our case, it was higher education, because we are the one country where sports and education are so closely tied. The rest of the world is not doing as well as we are right now, because our teams are just making all sorts of strides because we have such a strong program at the collegiate level. Now, the International Olympic Committee, and I, as you know, or you were told, I became a member in 1986, and back then I wasn't one of the old guys, and I'm still not an old white guy. So there is a little bit of diversity within the membership of the IOC. But, you know, I am grateful for the old white guys because they kept the Olympic movement alive. They gave of their time and energy. They were not paid. And back before 1980, when a check arrived from the LA Olympic Organizing Committee of $20 million, which wasn't cashed for a month, because they weren't used to having money, or else they lost the check, which is more likely. But they didn't cash it, and the interest over that ran the cost of staff for nearly a year. That was back when interest was like 20%. So we were very happy that they didn't cash it. But after we had the Centennial Congress in 1994, they decided that it was time to increase participation by women because it was pitifully low. And the president named Juan Antonio Samaranch from Spain, from Barcelona, which is actually Catalan, but that region of Spain, was amazingly the best person for women's promotion. He was the first IOC president to have women elected, and he was committed to increasing the numbers of women involved in sport. Okay, and since he created a working group on women in sport, and he asked me to chair it, I wanted it to remain a working group because my goal was to work ourselves out of business. And I thought that was very clever. Well, as it turns out, in the Olympic World Commissions have more power. That's what we call our committees. So I eventually had to cave, and it became a commission. But we started our work here in Atlanta. The games in Atlanta were remarkable. It was the first time in the history of the Olympic movement that all of the National Olympic Committees who could come to the games did come to the games. So 197 National Olympic Committees were here. Sadly, there were 26 without any women. And in those 26, only 2 had ever had women on their team. So that became a goal to make sure that those 26 would have women. And in fact, we set out a number of goals, and among them were the decision to have a 2-step, that we would look at the numbers in the governance of the National Olympic Committees and in how many athletes, women athletes, the National Olympic Committees had. We'd look at the governance of the continental organizations. We'd look at the governance of the international sports federations, and we would certainly look at the percentage of athletes at every Olympic Games. And our goal initially was to have at least 10% of the governing bodies, including the IOC. We also looked at the IOC, which for a while was remarkably slow at meeting its own goals, embarrassingly slow. But our goal was that by the year 2001, we would have at least 10% of the governing bodies in sports comprised of women, and then by 2005 have 20%. Now, there were some people who said, that's terrible, you're doing quotas, and others people saying, well, that's way too modest, and others saying, oh, there's no way we can ever do that, so that's way too impressive numbers. But over time, the naysayers said it was a good thing to keep track of the numbers to see what the progress was. And although we started here in Atlanta with 26 NOCs without women, for the games in London, the last 3 holdouts, Brunei Darussalam, Qatar, and guess what the other one was? Yes, I heard it, Saudi Arabia, finally had women on their team. So now there is no National Olympic Committee in the world without women Olympians. London was also remarkable because, I'm sure you can't read that very well, but because it was the first time in the history of the Games that all of the sports on the program had events for women. Boxing was the last sport to include women, and a U.S. woman won a gold medal. There were only 3 weight categories, which is pitiful, but they'll have to have more. The problem is that because we had to limit the number of athletes in each sport, in sports like boxing, in order to make opportunities for women, they had to take opportunities for men. And I said, and? look how many years you've not had opportunities for women. So it's not a bad bargain to change that up. So in the games here in 1996, the percentage of athletes, women athletes, was 34%. And I'm proud to report that in the London Games, the percentage was 44.2%. We did that by working with the international federations and making sure that not only the governing bodies, but the sports program had more opportunities for women. Our goal is to have 50-50 at the games, and we can do that. We should be able to do this in another game or two. For the Olympic Winter Games, I kind of got tricked. I had given up the chairmanship of the commission after 18 years. I figured somebody else should do it. And I forgot to check on the new sports that were put on the program. And again, since there had been slippage in who was in the governance, it seemed logical that for a new sport on the program, men would have 20 positions and women would only have 10. And that happened in practically every one of the new events. Now, why that was logical still escapes my understanding, but that's what happened. So I've made sure that the new sports director knows that I will be watching this time to make sure that there is not just blind faith in allowing certain numbers of athletes and excluding women. But at the Olympic Winter Games in Sochi, we finally had women's ski jumping, which was the last discipline that had no women in it. I don't know why ski jumping. The women are doing crazy things in aerials and bobsled and all these other very challenging sports. And ski jumping was the last bastion, but now it's been closed. We just have to work to let them jump the big hills. My theory is that the problem in ski jumping is that women will jump further because women's bodies are lighter. Sadly, many of the men who ski jump are anorexic, and that's kind of their little secret. They wear those puffy uniforms so they look like the Michelin tire guys, but that's for wind resistance and all that. But there is a terrible tradition in the sport of losing weight so that you can fly better. So women, once they learn the technique, I predict will fly further. And there is a U.S. woman who has done that already a couple of times on the hills in Oslo, Norway, which is kind of the Valhalla of that sport. So it's going to happen, and we'll have to live with it. It happens. As I said, we looked at the IOC itself, and as we saw how many women were elected, and our goal was to have at least 20%. Over time, 37 women have been elected. The first woman was elected in 1981, and her name was Pir-Jo Hagman, although they have Flor Asava up there first. That's not correct. I have to tell them to correct that. Protocol order is very important in the IOC. It determines where you sit, and that helps you if you're from Iraq and Iran. If you are elected at the same time, you will sit next to each other. Doesn't matter. It helps an athlete sit ahead of a president of that same sport because the athlete was elected by its peers before the president of the sport was elected. And it helps in fights with royalty. There are no fights with royalty, but it makes it much easier so there's protocol order, and that's how the IOC has managed to survive all these years. So in 1996, there were 8 women on the IOC. And as of last year, we had 24. So we had made at least 20% of the IOC. The mandatory size of the IOC cannot exceed 115 now. So if you have 24, you've got over 20%. So now we need to move further, and I'm certain that we will. Because as you probably know, in the US and other places, they've done research and they found that boards of directors that have both women and men do better jobs than single-sex boards. And that's what we are in the IOC. We're the boards of director. Oops, I want to do a better job of spelling, but I get to reference the place where I work again as places where you can learn a lot about sport and certainly the International Olympic Committee. These two websites can tell you a lot, and you may find it somewhat challenging to use the Olympic.org. It'll give you an idea how different cultures put together websites. Is that enough to say? I see some people here who know what I mean. It is the hardest website to navigate, I think, in the world, but a lot of good information. So you've heard me talk for quite some time. So now I'm going to ask you that favor I mentioned. I want you to find the oldest woman or man that you know and take your cell phone, which used to be a phone, but does all sorts of things now, and do an oral history with that person. Because there's so much we can learn from those who've been here longer. Stories that you can't even imagine. You may have known this person all your life, but you've never talked to them this way. And if you do that, you will increase the respect that we have and increase the knowledge. I got to know all of my grandparents and all of my great-grandparents, which is unique. And I do remember my favorite great-grandmother, Grandma Lucas, who was about yay tall, but was the strongest woman I ever knew. And I asked my mother once, how come she spends her work job cleaning other people's houses and ironing and washing their clothes? Why does she do that? You know, Mom, you're educated, you went to college, and why is Grandma? So my very wise and evolved mother said to me, why don't you ask her? So I'm 8 years old, and it was fine to ask my mother that, but it was a different matter to ask my grandmother. So I finally got the courage to ask her. And she said, you know, sweetheart, things were different. I only got to go to 4th grade. I wanted to be a nurse because I wanted to help people. But you can do whatever you want. And so those words, I could do whatever I want. I didn't take it too far, but I took it with me as a talisman, knowing that my great-grandmother believed in me, that I could do what I wanted. So I urge you to learn from the people who've been here for a very, very long time. And the other reason is, I know there's been a lot of talk about this next phrase I'm going to use. I believe I heard it first in church. I do know that I read it in June Jordan's poetry, and certainly we all know that Alice Walker used it. And recently, President Obama used it. But I have long believed that a good idea belongs to everybody, so everyone can use it. And the idea that we have to believe in, I think, is that we are the ones we've been waiting for. We cannot wait for others to do the job that needs to be done. We know what it is, so it's our obligation to make sure that the job gets done. We are the ones we've been waiting for. I thank you very much for your attention. And now I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Oh, she would like to
that
say.
we have time for some questions, yeah.
Yes.
I'm curious to know how your Olympic Committee in Los Angeles may have such a surplus when typically we hear recent Olympic efforts in different cities around the world with gigantic debt.
Okay. Let me first say that the debt comes only when there is capital construction. In Sochi, you heard probably that it cost $51 billion for those games. Well, why on earth would anybody spend $51 billion for 2 weeks of sport? No one would do that. What they were doing is going from 0 to 100% in 7 years. They had no winter sports. They had built their winter sports facilities in one of their stands when they were the Soviet Union. And so that stuff is all in that stand. In fact, it's in Kazakhstan. And they had nothing. So when they bid to host the games, we knew that they had to build everything. And we just did not manage that information properly. We should have kept saying that they're going from 0 to 100% in 7 years. And we don't really know how much they spent, because you don't know how much a government spends. But it certainly wasn't because of the 2-week sport event. And I know it's going to be hard to believe, but they had a $50 million surplus, which is modest when you spend $50 billion, but that's the surplus that the accountants at the IOC acknowledge and accept. And by the way, the IOC puts the money back into sport. 10 million of that 50 million could have been kept by the IOC, but instead we put it back and asked that it go to winter sports or whatever sports in Russia, because we're like that. We want the National Olympic Committees to do better. How did Los Angeles do it? We didn't build anything. We had existing facilities, and in the case of the swim stadium, McDonald's built that, the velodrome, 7-Eleven, and they were both on campuses. So those campuses took the responsibility for managing it otherwise after the fact. We did build a shooting facility in an area that unfortunately was known for killings by shootings, and that has kind of fallen apart now. Yeah, it was a little embarrassing during the time, but what do you do? I'm not going to say the name for that reason. And it wasn't who you're thinking. It's a different city that we know in Southern California. But we really didn't have to build anything. And it was the first time, and this was the genius of Peter Ueberroth, that the corporations who were sponsors, the concept of exclusivity was used. So that Coca-Cola, who had been a sponsor for a long time, but this time they had to pay what was big bucks. It was $10 million, not $200,000. So the sponsorships were for big amounts of money, and we budgeted poorly. We raised $750 million for an event that cost only $550. But there was a $100 million swing with the television rights if they hadn't met a certain percentage of viewers. We would not have made $100 million. That was in the contract with ABC then. All of that has changed. The IOC now actually produces the world feed instead of having the host broadcast by a local broadcast company. So that cost has gone away too. So the IOC absorbs that cost. So it doesn't have to cost. And the capital construction, it's not really a debt. It's people are using. The Montreal was the famous one on this continent, and two things happened. The mayor loved this architect who was French, and the designs, and they couldn't produce the thin shell concrete designs in Montreal, so they actually flew parts of the stadium from France to Montreal, which did not make the unions happy, needless to say. And so there were other issues. So there were cost overruns. But the subways are still there. The ones that we took in '76 were brand new, still work. So again, the actual running of the games did not go into deficit. It was the capital construction. And we didn't have to build anything, so we were much better off. Sorry it took so long answering that one. We'll go here and then here. Okay.
I enjoyed your presentation and appreciate your perseverance and leadership, many years work, it sounds like. I actually have a best friend and classmate that was probably the first young woman to go to college on a tennis scholarship back in 1972. So she really made history, and I'm going to give a story quarter and get after her. Thank you. My question is sort of related to women have different strengths and different body types, and as we talked about sporting, and I didn't even realize women were boxers, so that's good for me to learn that. But you probably watched a little bit about what's going on in the military and the special forces of the Marine Corps, and the women that have to carry 105-pound packs, and they're only 102 pounds, and they have to do the same type, And I was just wondering if you have a balanced perspective or comment about just the way the Marine Corps is not budging at all on their expectations that a 102-pound woman has to do exactly what a 250-pound Special Forces Marine Corps person in order to qualify.
Well, I can tell you that when I was fully fit, I was stronger than the average man. I could lift more, I could do more work, and when we would go When I was training in Philadelphia at Vesper Boat Club, I was training while I was in law school at Penn, so we'd go into the weight room, and the guys didn't want to work out with us because we were lifting more weights and pushing more iron than they were. Because if you're focused on what you're doing, it's up to the individual. It's kind of hard to imagine a 100-pound person doing the same as a 200-pound person, but it's not from my imagination. It's the individual who wants to do it and rise to the occasion if she can. And you know, we are one of the last nations in the world to respect women in combat. Other nations have had them for a very long time. And so it's new to us, but it's not new in the world.
I thank you for being here. I just wanted to point out that, you know, in Atlanta, we followed the LA model and tried to build as little as possible. And most of what we did build continuous improvements to Georgia State, Georgia Tech, Atlanta University, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
It was a brilliant
Yeah,
model.
the real difference here was that, and I don't want to jam anybody up, but because there weren't other funds early on, they kind of went early into the television contract and left a lot of money on the table. And that money probably would have been a larger surplus, I guess. I think we were reporting that it was break even, and that included that about $120 million went to the U.S. Olympic Committee, because when the games are in the U.S. Olympic Committee has to give up some sponsorship rights in order to, because they're partners with the organizing committees. So the USOC insists on having at least $120 million come out of that. So if the USOC hadn't insisted on that, it might have been better. But they need it because there is no federal support for the athletes. And so unless the money is raised, it doesn't exist for the athletes to learn how to compete and to go places. So, but you guys did a good job. But if you waited a little bit longer for the television contract, it might have been even better. That's what people were saying at the time. Who knows what the truth is?
Ms. DeFrantz, I have a question that may be a little uncomfortable for you. What is the basis of the power and the clout that IOC members have? Whatever the IOC as a body wants, it usually gets done. And when IOC members want something in amateur sports, people, when they ask, when you ask them to jump, they ask how high. What is the basis of that power?
Well, I can answer that so many ways. One way would be to say, well, we're the experts. We know what's important to happen for the Olympic movement because that's what we do and that's our responsibility. We say, we make an oath, swear an oath to be loyal to the Olympic movement in front of all our peers. It's a very interesting ceremony. Another answer would be that was then, but this is now. Atlanta was won the games during the time where bidding was a whole different world. And the visits to the bidding cities were very important, and that's where you get the idea that whatever an IOC member wants, even if it's to have you jump, people would do it because they wanted to make sure that IOC member voted for them. And there certainly was no way to ensure a vote because the voting is by secret ballot, which it has to be in order that IOC members are not savaged in their own countries when they go back. It has to be secret ballot. And by the way, the Red Cross keeps its minutes secret for 50 years. We keep them secret for only 15. But it's no longer that. We're working with bidding cities this time. There's another thing you can look at on the website is the 2020 or 20 plus 20. I forget what they're called. We work Agenda 2020. Yeah, thank you very much. And we're doing things differently. We're working with the bid cities. It's an invitation instead of here's the list of things you have to have. We don't visit the cities anymore because it was just uncomfortable. I mean, I remember we usually had a city bidding, so I would need to reciprocate and visit the other cities and also pick up intelligence if I could. It was uncomfortable because at one time I realized that I couldn't say, oh, that's really pretty, I like that, because next thing I know it'd be in my room. And I didn't say I want to have it, I was just commenting on it. And so there can be a lot of confusion when people are doing their best to get your vote and they don't know how, because how can you meet somebody and become best friends? That rarely happens in life. So how on earth are you going to become best friends with 115 people in order to get their vote? So it was this bizarre situation that was created. It happened because an ILC member in 1985 said, excuse me, I've been asked to come and visit the cities. Is that okay? He asked at the session. We call our annual meeting. By the way, we meet once a year. We're not like Congress. We only meet once a year. Actually, they kind of meet once a year now, don't they? Come to think of it. So he asked, can I go? And the president said, well, why not? And so in '86, there happened to be 6 cities vying for the Olympic Games and 7 cities vying for the Olympic Winter Games. And in 2 cases, a country had both. So this was just a mass hysteria trying to get votes, and it was the worst of all cases. And I was elected at the end of the session. You're elected at the end of the session because the moment you become an ILC member, you have all the rights. But I didn't know any of the information about any of the cities, so I had to be elected after the voting was done. And so my colleagues said, oh, you missed a big birthday. I said, what? I know when my birthday is. They said, no, all these things were showered on us. We didn't want them, but they kept giving us stuff. And it became ridiculous. So we just stopped it in 1998, I think we stopped it, because we learned about bad corruption in Salt Lake City. Their biggest corruption was they kept records of everything. If they had not kept records, perhaps they wouldn't have been busted. But the sad thing, now that I've said that, the truth of the matter is that the previous bidding, Toronto had kept a record of the ILC members who had abused their privilege as an ILC member, but they wouldn't release the names because they said they were afraid of these volunteers being sued. Which I thought was nonsense. And it turned out that they were the same people who had abused their privileges all along, even with Atlanta and then with Salt Lake City. And they were booted out. Not that we had any legal basis, but they had embarrassed. The basis was they had embarrassed the Olympic movement. And it was a horrible thing to have them make their case after they had been adjudged and there was a report on what they had done wrong. And then they tried to convince us not to boot them out, and they were all booted out. So we're different than we used to be. That's my answer, I hope. And there are more athletes who are elected by their peers. Yes, all the way in the back.
So I have a question. So you and I will appear in a documentary about the 1936 Olympics. And so
I wasn't there.
Well, not appearing as athletes, but talking heads. So my question for you is, why is it important to study sports?
Well, for so many reasons. I think that we have not done a good job of understanding sport and how, again, the body is directed by the mind and into that zone of excellence. If we could learn how you get to that, maybe we could do better at all things in life. Politically, if you learn about the mistakes were made, by the way, the IOC did not elect Berlin under the Nazi flag. Berlin was elected well before anybody knew who Adolf Hitler was. And once we elect a city, we don't change unless there's an impossibility. And sadly, the one city that changed was Denver when they said, oh, well, that thing about the '76 Olympic Winter Games, we were just kidding. So you can have them back. And that was like 2 years before. So they went, fortunately, there was a city that could do it, but that's a memory of the IOC. But you learn so much about history and what goes on. I got to interview a woman who competed in the 1920 games, and she was still kicking. She rode her stationary bike every day, and she told me how her parents allowed her across the country to New York, where she took a boat to Europe and competed. And she told me this great story. She was a diver, how they had built the diving platform at the wrong end of the pool. So you were up on the platform, you couldn't see the pool. You just had to believe it was there because you couldn't see it because of the way they built it. So just wonderful stories and understanding how people interacted with one another during the boycott years. The fact that the games were not taken from the United States, the 84 games were not wrested from the United States after the boycott of the 80 games in Moscow was amazing. And the people from the Eastern Bloc supported keeping the games in Los Angeles. Now, how do you do that? Well, they were dedicated to the Olympic movement and the person making sure that the games continued, even if their overseers back home would have wanted them to do something differently. It's important because it's about people coming together and respecting one another. My first time at the Olympic Games and living in the Olympic Village was just incredible because I was living in a community where everyone was successful. They had all been selected by their nation to represent them. It was a beautiful place. People came in all shapes, sizes, both sexes, and you could sit down with anybody and have a meal. And inside the Olympic Village, countries that are sworn enemies would sit down and have a meal together. North and South Korea always ate together here in Atlanta. Nobody outside of the village knew that, but I saw them every day eating together. So it was originally a peace movement, interestingly enough, and many of the people who were the first IOC members were a part of the peace movement. And even there was a woman who was, I'm going to forget her name now, I'm so sorry, but her name was on the list of promoters of the first meeting. It said Baron, but the Baron had been dead for about 15 years, so it had to have been the Baroness, who was the woman who was secretary to Albert Nobel. And once he died, thank you. That's her name. Precisely, thank you, scholar. And she was Albert Nobel's secretary, and she set up the Nobel Peace Prizes. And in fact, there was actually one of the IOC members was the son of a famous women's rights advocate in the U.S. So it was the people who came together for the Olympic movement believed in peace, as I do. And although we don't talk about it all the time, you might have seen that Secretary of State Kerry was in the Olympic Museum because in these talks that he was having with Iran, the press conference was actually held at the Olympic Museum, which was really nice for us to be able to do that. And so I could go on. There are lots of reasons. And sport starts at the local level and goes all the way to the world level and back.
We have time for one more question. Y'all hungry?
Yeah, and I see my nephew back there, who is a Morehouse man.
Nephew.
Welcome.
But we did want to thank Ms. DeFrantz so much.
Well, thank you very much.
But thank you very much. And we want to invite all of you to a reception that's happening in the living room right next door. So as we trickle out. And then per her request that we record our stories, I will let you know that on Friday, we do have a StoryCorps booth at the Center for Women. So if any of you do know someone that you want to bring in, please let me know. We have a few more slots available, and we're trying to fill them by tomorrow. So if you actually know someone, we'll be there. And they're hour-long slots from 9 to 5, so they'll be there all day. So please let me know, and thank you again very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.